Welcome, everybody. This is the webinar for the third exposure draft, the proposed revisions to USPAP, the Appraisal Standards Board webinar. First, I would like to do a quick welcome and introduction. I'm Lisa Desmarais. I'm the Vice President of Appraisal Issues here at the Appraisal Foundation. I've been with the foundation since April 1st of this year, technically, formally, and prior to that, I was a residential appraiser in my other life. Wayne, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Certainly. My name is Wayne Miller. I'm the chair of the Appraisal Standards Board. It's a pleasure to be with you, Lisa.
Thanks, Wayne. To get started today, we always have to cover the webinar logistics to make sure you understand what we're going to be doing here today. So the webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our website and on our YouTube channel. That usually takes about a day or two to happen, but it will be available in case you want to go back and get any other information again. As far as Q&As go, time permitting, at the very end of the presentation, we will answer some questions. We've usually had time to do that, so I expect that will happen today as well. If you're interested in asking a question, all you have to do is move your mouse to the bottom of the screen and a little menu pops up, or where one of the options shows the chat feature, or you can just simply enable the chat feature by using the keyboard shortcut of Alt plus H. You probably want to have the chat box up and running so you can see it, because in that chat box, you're going to see the links will be posted to any of the documents that we discussed today. And you're also going to see a PDF so that you can get a copy of the presentation. At the very end of this presentation today, there will be a very, very quick survey. We just like to get your feedback to make sure we're giving these correctly if you have any feedback on how we can improve. So we can move to the agenda now. We've got, first, it's to your benefit, I think, if we can just really quickly let you know what we're going to cover today. So I've got agenda part 1 and agenda part 2. This agenda part 1, we're going to talk about labeling, what we originally opposed and where the new direction that we're headed in. We're going to talk about changes to inspection requirements that we're proposing for the scope of work reporting. Also some very general requirements for the reporting standards. We've got, Wayne is going to go over proposed revision to the preamble, the very first 2 sentences of USPAP. And we've also got changes proposed for certification language, clarifications about signing of certifications, and edits to wording of various different standards rules. For the agenda part 2 today, we're going to talk about those specific disclosure obligation sections of the scope of work rule that are proposed for revision. We've got some definitions we're looking at, and we've just got some, as always, some just basic edits to improve the clarity of USPAP. Style updates to pronouns. And then, as I mentioned before, as we have time, we're going to answer any of your questions that you post in the chat box and hopefully help you out there. And we're going to let you know how you can submit your comments to the ASB and when the next ASB public meeting is, because as I always like to say, comments are the lifeblood of the ASB, and we need comments from you on any of these topics that you feel are relevant to you. So with that, we can get started with all the official information. I'm going to hand the floor over here to Wayne. And first, what he's going to discuss for you today is changes to labeling. So Wayne, is labeling a report as an evaluation still being proposed today?
Well, thank you, Lisa. And the short answer is no. So due to the rise in the de minimis levels that were being enacted by the interagency group, the ASB was asked to consider whether changes to USPAP could or should be made to clarify whether appraisers can complete evaluations and how they would do so in compliance with USPAP. So as a result, the ASB has made a good faith effort over the past year to study issues related to real property evaluations in mortgage lending. And these efforts included a public hearing, meetings with state regulators, targeted surveys of state regulators and bank chief appraisers, in addition to 2 previous exposure drafts of potential changes. And along the way, the ASB developed some sample evaluations that comply with USPAP and also include the content suggestions of the interagency appraisal evaluation guidelines. And these samples are posted on the Appraisal Foundation website. So the wording of those prior exposure drafts was designed to allow some flexibility for appraisers to avoid using the label appraisal report or restricted appraisal report when they were conveying the results as an evaluation. However, several possible unintended consequences were identified via the feedback that we received from stakeholders. In the end, the purpose of USPAP is to promote and maintain a high level of public trust in appraisal practice. So after carefully considering the stakeholder feedback, the ASB has concluded that the potential solutions that were being proposed would likely create confusion for appraisers and users of appraisal services and regulators, which ultimately would damage public trust. So we have withdrawn those proposals. But to be clear, from a USPAP perspective, an appraiser can complete an evaluation and adhere to the USPAP rules and standards rules for real property development and reporting. However, it is up to the appraiser to understand any state laws or regulations which might impact completing an evaluation. Lisa, are you on mute?
Well, I sure am. How about that? Thanks, Wayne.
I could keep talking, but I think it's your turn.
I had a really good question for you. Would you like to hear it? Okay, Wayne, can you give us an overview of the changes that are proposed to the reporting standards in Section 1 of the exposure draft?
Well, I am happy to do so, Lisa. So as noted here on slide 7 of the presentation, there are 3 main areas in which changes are being proposed. First off would be disclosure of whether or not an inspection was performed. The second is the removal of a repeating comment. And then the third is the renumbering of a portion of Standards Rule 6-2.
Ah, okay. How about, can you give us, let us get into the details now. I mean, what changes specifically is the ASB proposing with regard to the disclosure of inspections?
Lisa, due to new developments in the marketplace, such as the use of third-party inspectors, unmanned aerial devices or drones, and video inspections, the current binary wording in the certification, which reads, I have or have not conducted a personal inspection, has become frankly complicated. And judging by the questions that the ASB has received, appraisers are increasingly uncertain about what qualifies as a personal inspection. And furthermore, without additional information, clients may not understand what the appraiser actually did to collect information about relevant property characteristics. So as such, the ASB is proposing to expand the scope of work reporting in standards 2, 4, 6, and 8. So appraisers are required to clearly communicate whether or not an inspection was performed. Additional requirements would be to provide information about the extent of inspection and the party or parties who performed it. Furthermore, if no inspection was performed, then the appraiser would be required to indicate how information about relevant property characteristics was collected.
So the text on the screen here indicates that this change is proposed for Standards Rule 2-2A. Are similar changes being proposed elsewhere in USPAP?
That's a good question, Lisa. And for purposes of the webinar, for this issue, as well as several others, we're only displaying the proposed changes in 2-2A, and this would be the requirement for a real property appraisal report. So the proposal is actually similar in 2-2B, which would be for a restricted appraisal report for real property. However, in that case, summarize would be replaced by the word state. And similar changes are proposed in standards 4, 6, and 8 for appraisal review, mass appraisal, and personal property appraisal reporting. And also, as will be revealed later in our discussion, if this change is adopted, or if these changes are adopted, there would be updates and revisions to the certification section, as well as the definition of personal inspection. And then finally, if this is adopted, additional guidance, including a rewrite of Advisory Opinion 2, as well as a number of FAQs would be in order.
Great. Thanks for that clarification, Wayne. I think that helps a lot. Moving on to slide number 9 in the deck, what other revisions are being proposed in Standards Rule 2-2?
Well, the highlighted change noted at the bottom of slide 9 is a proposed deletion of a comment in the reporting standards that repeats verbatim wording that is already present in the scope of work rule.
Can you move on to telling us a little bit about the change that is proposed to Standards Rule 6-2?
Well, certainly. The ASB actually proposes to renumber this section to better delineate two different requirements that are currently listed together in Standards Rule 6-2G. The first of these requirements is to summarize the scope of work, and the second is to explain the exclusion of the approaches. These are bunched together currently, and we're looking to split them apart. And if adopted, this change, of course, will make the numbering of Standards Rule 6-2 consistent with the other reporting standards rules.
Okay, great. Now, how about we move on to giving us a quick overview of the topics that are addressed in Section 2 of the exposure draft, which is called the other proposed changes to reporting requirements.
Well, certainly. The changes noted on here on slide 11 actually involve the deletion of a phrase that created confusion for some folks regarding the receipt of an appraisal report by someone who's not an intended user. And the second is a rewording of the introduction to the reporting standards rules 2-2, 8-2, and 10-2, as well as the deletion of some repetitive text in the reporting standards.
This is probably a good point where I would like to ask you to tell us more about the potential deletion of the phrase regarding disclosure obligations.
Well, certainly. This is just for reference for folks who have sat through our prior webinars on exposure drafts this year. This is a continuation, actually, of a proposal from those earlier exposure drafts. So, for context here, let's remember that an intended user is one who's identified as such by the appraiser in the assignment and in the report. And some stakeholders have expressed confusion regarding the current wording of this comment, which sets forth a specific incident in which a recipient of a report does not become an intended user. Well, the wording of this comment actually implies, if you will, that there may be cases where a mere recipient of a report does become an intended user. So the proposed deletion is designed to enforce the concept that just because a party receives a copy of an appraisal report or a restricted appraisal report, they do not become an intended user. They must have been identified as an intended user by the appraiser as a part of the assignment.
Great explanation, Wayne. Thank you so much. Let's move on to slide number 13 so that I can ask you to discuss the other revisions that are proposed in Standards Rule 2-2.
Right. Well, this, the rewording of this introductory paragraph, we believe, will eliminate some redundancy and improve readability and understandability, but it really doesn't represent a material change in the requirements. As displayed here on slide 13, we're proposing to begin Standards Rule 2-2 as well as 8-2 and 10-2 with the statement, the content and level of information provided in an appraisal report must be appropriate for the intended use and intended users of the appraisal. So this statement doesn't need to be repeated at the beginning of the content requirements for each report type.
Great, thanks for explaining all the proposed changes for 2-2. Let's jump to the very front of USPAP now, and can you please introduce us to the revisions that the ASB is proposing to the preamble?
Well, certainly. I'm not gonna read this slide to you, and I also don't want to give away the content of the next slide. So I'll just state that the ASB proposes to revise 2 sentences of the preamble.
Well, great. Thanks for the suspense. So let's move on to slide number 15.
You know, we've got to have a little fun here.
I
So
know. So it looks like this. Here's the slide you were talking about that displays these proposed changes. Can you give us the background on this?
certainly. The first proposed change is to highlight requirements that are present in the ethics rule and are fundamental to public trust and appraisal practice, and frankly, deserve greater attention in the context of current events, namely the appraiser's responsibilities to be impartial, objective, and independent. And the additional proposed revisions are intended to underline the distinction between the task of development and the task of communication, and to help emphasize the USPAP requirement for an appraiser to be both ethical and competent.
Great. Now that we were just in the front of USPAP, we're going to kind of jump to the back of a report and what changes you have proposed here. So can you give us a quick overview of the proposed changes in, this will be section 4 of the exposure draft regarding certification and signatures?
Well, I am happy to do so. So as noted here on slide 16 of the presentation, there are 3 areas in which changes are being proposed. The first is an actual change to the certification language. The second one would be changes to the signature wording to accommodate evolving methods of signing, air quotes, signing an appraisal report. And then last, edits to 2-3C, which include an administrative edit and a clarification to the comment.
Great. And then obviously in keeping with Wayne's desire to have a little suspension, the details are on the following slides. So let's take a look at those.
Right,
slide number
good.
17. This proposed change looks familiar based upon our earlier discussion about reporting.
Well, right you are. This would be the companion or parallel change with regard to the changes proposed in the scope of work reporting requirements, back in the reporting standard. So we essentially, this would replace that binary I have or have not made a personal inspection language with wording that indicates that the appraiser has disclosed in the report whether or not an inspection was made, and if so, by whom.
Well, Wayne, why is the ASB proposing to amend Standards Rule 2-2B and 2-3C, as well as the parallel standards rules for the other disciplines, regarding the nature of a signature on a certification?
Well, certainly. This is, just also for reader edification or listener edification. This is actually a change from what was proposed in prior exposure drafts. Previously, the ASB had proposed clarifications to the concept of a signature here in Standards Rule 2-2B. And this was done to really take into account the evolving nature of electronic delivery of appraisals. So, via feedback and several comment letters that we have received, we've moved some of those revisions that were originally proposed for this section into a proposed amendment to the definition of signature, which we'll discuss when we get back to the definitions portion of the webinar. But as we reviewed this section and other requirements in USPAP, we contemplated what it means to sign an appraisal. Back in the day, when we used to work with typewriters and paper and pencils and pens, signing an appraisal report meant taking your pen and literally placing your proverbial John Hancock at the bottom of the certification. And this was within a printed and bound or stapled hard copy of an appraisal report. However, with the continued technological advancements in the electronic delivery of appraisal assignment results, the concept of a signature continues to evolve. And as we did our research, thankfully, we found that USPAP already had the basis of an answer for us. In fact, the management section of the ethics rule refers to an appraiser affixing one's signature rather than using the term sign or sign in. So while one could argue that sign and affix a signature are basically synonymous terms, the changes proposed in this section makes the wording consistent with the ethics rule where feasible, changing signs to affixes a signature.
Well, and with that sign, I will affix to move to the next slide.
All righty.
Slide number 19, it seems to reflect relatively minor changes to wording. Can you provide the listeners with a background on these proposed changes?
Well, certainly. The first item is a relatively minor change. In this case, the clause is required to happens to be used here in Standards Rule 2-3C1 if we dig way down. However, elsewhere in USPAP, the term must is used. So this change really just makes this rule consistent with the wording in other parts of USPAP. The second item actually cleans up some wording in the comment for this standards rule. The new wording is, we believe, simpler and emphasizes the main point, which is that the appraiser's disclosure of the extent of assistance may be in any part or parts of the report.
Okay, great. Let's move on to slide 20. Can you give us some details of the proposed changes to the scope of work reporting disclosure rule?
Well, certainly. So as in prior exposure drafts, the ASB continues to propose the deletion of the statement, proper disclosure is required because clients and other intended users rely on the assignment results. So a comment was actually received from a stakeholder in response to the first exposure draft questioning why this type of explanation is considered necessary only here in the scope of work rule. And after considering the matter, the ASB is now proposing to delete this portion of the comment. The rationale is that, an appraiser is required to understand the intended use of the appraisal report, and therefore the comment seems redundant. Before we move on, I just want to mention one thing. I'll note here a comment was received from a stakeholder. And later on, we're going to ask our listeners to provide comments in response to the exposure draft. And I really want to emphasize that, this one comment received by one stakeholder really got the board thinking about the need for this language and whether this language might cause people to act differently or perform differently when completing an appraisal assignment or appraisal review assignment. And in fact, it did help us to what we believe is clarify the language and eliminate any confusion.
Boy, I'm so glad you brought that up.
Welcome those comments.
I was thinking the same exact thing. I mean, it's just to always reiterate to people that we literally read every sentence they get. And some of the board members, put them in spreadsheets and graph them. So they're very, very important. So thanks for pointing that out, Wayne.
Sure.
Okay, so let's move on. You had earlier mentioned, or I had mentioned that you'd be talking about there will be some revisions to a few existing definitions, the deletion of one, and a few new definitions are being proposed. So can you briefly cover these potential changes?
Well, certainly. As slide 21, I believe we're on 21 notes here, there are 3 definitions that are proposed to be added. And we have 7 existing definitions that are proposed to be revised. One thing that the slide does not include is the one definition that we continue to propose to delete, which is misleading.
That's very clever of you not to put it on the slide, but to talk about it.
Well, we already deleted it. We deleted it from this. Anyway.
Just kidding. Okay, so remind us why the ASB is proposing to delete the definition of misleading. I know you just mentioned it, but let's get some more detail on that.
Sure. Well, despite some changes that we made in the 2020-21 edition of USPAP, to clarify, as a part of the competency rule that perfection is impossible to attain, some stakeholders have expressed concern that a simple typographical error in a report could be viewed as misleading under the current definition. So the ASB has considered this issue, and we note the following. The conduct section of the ethics rule prohibits the appraiser from communicating results with the intent to mislead or defraud, and also from allowing others to do so. And the development standards, of course, those are standards 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, address the appraiser's responsibility to not commit a substantial error of omission or commission that significantly affects an appraisal. Therefore, the ASB has concluded that the appraiser's responsibilities to avoid errors are clear and the definition is not needed.
Thank you for being extremely clear and not a bit misleading in your explanation, Wayne. Now, what new definitions are being proposed by the ASB?
All right. Well, it's noted on our screen here, and I won't read them to you, but there are 3 new definitions proposed in this third exposure gap. Pardon me. Significant appraisal, or parenthetically, or appraisal review assistance, state, and summarize. So, and in the case of new definitions, the ASB's goal here is to provide context as to the meaning of these terms, which are included in USPAP, but are not currently defined. As you know, Lisa, the ASB often gets questions about significant appraisal assistance. What is it? What isn't it? And the proposed definition here seeks to clarify what the term means in USPAP. In addition, state and summarize are used throughout the reporting standards, but have not been defined. And we're seeking to clarify the difference in the amount of information, if you will, to be presented in each instance.
Great. Finally, can you go over what revisions are proposed to any of the existing definitions?
Yes, this is a little bit longer list. So the first definition proposed for revision is the definition of appraiser. So in the current 2020-21 version of USPAP, a revision was made to this definition that some stakeholders felt unintentionally broadened the definition to encompass a whole host of non-appraisers who may be acting competently and independently. Namely, this was the deletion of a comment that we felt was redundant. So let me note that the ASB doesn't necessarily agree with this broad interpretation, since the preamble to USPAP clearly indicates when USPAP applies. However, since the goal of the ASB is for USPAP to be readable and understandable and enforceable, the ASB is proposing the noted revision to this definition in an effort to address stakeholders' concerns. Next would be assignment elements. So the definition here of assignment elements is proposed to be revised as well. The key addition is the phrase "such as," which indicates that the list of items which follows may not be all-inclusive. Now, let me be clear that the list of 6 assignment elements that is here in this definition currently is spot on for an appraisal assignment. These are the time-tested, well-established assignment elements for appraisal assignments. However, the definition also pertains to assignment elements for appraisal review assignments. And the board has noted that there's an additional appraisal review assignment element, which is purpose of the appraisal review. And this is noted in boldface text as Standards Rule 3-2C. So this relates to the reviewer's objectives in the assignment and actually drives a decision as to whether some of the other assignment elements are relevant to the appraisal review assignment. I'm going to note here, for the benefit of my board and very interested parties, that as a point of full disclosure, the ASB actually continues to discuss the revision to this definition, and we're very interested in hearing from stakeholders on their thoughts. Revisions to the definition of assignment results are also being proposed, actually to tighten up the wording and clarify which opinions and conclusions formed by an appraiser or a review appraiser are truly results of an assignment that must remain confidential in order to legitimately protect the client's interests. The current wording is very broad, and it could encompass opinions or conclusions that should not realistically be considered assignment results. Let's see, a minor edit is actually proposed to the definition of intended user, namely the addition of the word report, and folks can take a look at that. The definition of personal inspection, which I believe would be on the next slide, is also proposed to be revised. We touched on the changes proposed earlier in the exposure draft associated with inspection. So, if those changes are adopted, then this definition would actually be renamed inspection. We would get rid of personal. And furthermore, some edits are being proposed based on some other feedback received from stakeholders regarding the nature of an inspection as a part of the appraisal process. So some of this wording, we don't want to have confusion over elements of scope of work rule, et cetera. And some feedback we received indicated that we were crossing the streams a little bit there. Also a minor edit, the removal of the word may is proposed in the definition of relevant characteristics. This edit is proposed to clear up some ambiguity noted in the standards when referencing relevant characteristics elsewhere. And then finally, the definition of signature is proposed to be revised. I gave you a heads up on this earlier. In prior exposure drafts, the ASB had proposed edits to the standards rules regarding the nature of a signature. And stakeholders' comments actually led us to move some of those proposed revisions or clarifications to the definition itself, rather than embellishing the definition within the standards rules.
Great. Let's move on then to having you give us a quick overview of the proposed other edits.
Alrighty, well, once again, I'm happy to do so. As noted on slide 25 here, the ASB actually continues to propose changes in two areas. The addition of the word transfer to the sections requiring analysis and reporting of prior sales, and an administrative edit actually to the wording of Standards Rule 8-2B, which is personal property reporting, which would make it consistent with the parallel section within the same standard.
Great, and that's the overview of what you're going to cover now on these next slides. So let's get into details on these. What revisions is the ASB proposing to Standards Rule 1-5B and 2-2A and B with regard to prior sales of the subject property?
Well, as you know, Lisa, the ASB has received a number of questions, continues to receive questions regarding the analysis and reporting of a property sales history. In fact, Advisory Opinion 1 is dedicated to this topic. And to tell you how long it's been since people have had questions about this, Advisory Opinion 1 is the first of all the advisory opinions, right? So, in addition, there are a number of FAQs that are part of the guidance, in USPAP on this topic. So a lingering question in the real property arena specifically is the topic of transfers of properties that are not technically sales. So for example, a transfer of a property from a former owner to a lending institution via a deed in lieu of foreclosure. So after considering the rationale behind the requirement to analyze sales history in general, right, which is basically communicate the past to your client to see if what makes sense today, the ASB is proposing this revision to 1-5B, as well as the parallel references in 7-5 and 9-4 for personal property and business appraisal, respectively, to require the analysis of transfers when such information is available in the normal course of business. And the proposed changes to the companion reporting standards 2-2 A and B are actually noted on the next slide.
So it looks, this looks really similar to the one before. Do you have more explanation to give on this slide as well, Wayne?
Let's see. So are we on slide 28? Now we're on slide 28. Beautiful.
Wow.
The proposed revision noted on this slide involves Standard 8, which is personal property appraisal reporting. And the proposed revision is intended to make the language of 8-2B identical to the current 2020-21 USPAP language in 8-2A to help clarify that there's no difference in the requirements. The additional proposed language about sales and transfers, which we discussed previously, is also reflected here. And it should be noted that the requirement to analyze sales and transfers in Standards Rule 7-5, which is the personal property appraisal development standard, differs from 1-5, real property, because the requirement in 7-5 applies only when necessary for credible assignment results. Remember that 1-5 refers to market value, which a lot of folks use a common definition of market value for real property. Consequently, the language is very specific surrounding the definition of market value in 1-5.
Great. Thanks for that explanation. Let's move on, if you have your exposure draft handy, to section 8 of the exposure draft. Can you tell us more about the changes that are being proposed regarding style updates, and what are those?
Sure. And first off, I don't want folks to be scared by 3 pages in our report here, or 4 pages of potential edits to USPAP that seem like they may be terribly substantive. I guess I'll say we're interested in this case in eliminating some awkward, let's say, he or she, his or her wording. We've got an updated style guide at the foundation in general. Some of these one might even consider administrative edits, but frankly, we can't make administrative edits to USPAP on a wholesale basis because, frankly, public exposure and comment is necessary. In the end, the proposed pronoun usage revisions are designed to enhance the readability and update the wording to be consistent with current business writing style. I'll note that in examining the pronoun usage, the revision proposed in the preamble, which is listed as item 1 here on slide 29, it could be considered, I guess I'll say, a bit more substantive. The proposed revision would actually add consistency to the way the rules are presented in the preamble. It's important to note, I guess I'll say, that if these changes are adopted, then the ASB will plan to make administrative edits to achieve consistent pronoun usage through the advisory opinions and FAQs. And finally, I'll note that we haven't received too many comments yet. The exposure draft has been out for a few weeks. We haven't received too many comments, but one of the comments we did receive actually had some pretty good suggested tweaks, if you will, to the pronoun usage section that the board feels pretty positive about. So we may be adopting many of those.
Great. Well, with that, Wayne, I think, does that cover all of the summaries you wanted to give to everybody about the proposed changes?
I believe it does.
Great. Good.
Questions that happen to be out there and do my best to answer them.
Yes, they've been trying to watch the chat box here, and I've been getting some private questions, and I've got them noted here. So if you're ready, put on your thinking cap, and let's get to some questions for you. So the first one here, with regard to the proposed changes to reporting, what does the phrase Summarize the extent of the inspection mean from the ASB's perspective.
Righty. Well, in the larger sense, the expectation would be for the appraiser to communicate, what level of inspection was performed and by whom, right? So did the inspector perform only an exterior inspection, standing in the street? Did they enter the premises and perform an interior inspection? Did they stand in the foyer while their assistant ran around and took photos of the rest? If this is say a multiple unit property, maybe an apartment building, then, did the inspector simply view the office, the common area, the model units, or, did they go inspect a representative sample of the units in the complex? And for that matter, if there are multiple appraisers who performed an inspection, but they were done to different degrees, right? So maybe one exterior only, one did an interior inspection, then, the expectation would be, as a part of that scope of work reporting, that the extent of the inspection by each one would be summarized.
Okay. While you were talking, I see I have another question here that's quite similar to that one. So I'll just call it a follow-up question, even though I don't think it's the same person. If a third-party inspector completes the inspection, is the appraiser expected to just state that person's name, or should the appraiser have to provide additional information about who that person was, like their job title or something?
Right. Well, in its most basic sense, the requirement that's being proposed is to, name the inspector, or, there might be multiple, so name the inspectors, and to advise the client and intended users what they did. So it might be helpful to include more information on the inspector, and, if there's an inspection report that they did, included in the back as of the report as an attachment or an addendum, something along those lines. To the key is, communication, who did it and what was done.
So it sounds like it kind of goes back to that intended use, intended user issue. You're going to disclose what is needed for the assignment. Is that correct?
Yeah, and in thinking about the first question and sort of the extent of the inspection, there are certain clients who require a certain level of inspection. Thinking back to multifamily, some of the agency work, there's a requirement that a certain percentage of the units be inspected, and one is required to identify which units were inspected. So, clearly that's a client derived, expectation. But if we've learned anything from the pandemic, right, and the challenges that appraisers and uh, homeowners and property owners and tenants experienced, is that there might be other ways to gather information via some sort of, let's call it, hybrid inspection regime. And the important piece is that there's disclosure to the client as to what was done and who did it. If you have a specific agreement with a client for the appraiser to make an interior inspection, then an appraiser shouldn't be seeking ways to try to say they made an interior inspection when they didn't. I think that's part of it. They should fully disclose what was done and what was not done. And I'll also say that, based on some conversations I've had with the GSEs as they're going through their appraisal modernization process, I understand that there are some flexibilities, if you will, in terms of the disclosure of the inspection that are being discussed. I don't know what it's going to look like yet, and they're not sharing them with me just to have me sign off on them. I don't necessarily want that responsibility, but I will note that in some of the fixed certifications for some of the single unit appraisal forms that are out there. The level or extent of inspection is fairly well developed, right? There's discussion, was it interior, was it exterior only, was it just a quote unquote drive-by, or desktop, no inspection was done. So there are those more detailed disclosures that do live in some of the standard, if you will, the standard single unit appraisal forms that that seem to provide or communicate more information to the users of the appraisal report.
Along those lines, so this whole topic that the ASB is considering about the inspection and disclosures, did this topic kind of come into play because it was more of a timely response to what was happening in the market with COVID? Did it relate to that at all, or has this been developing a long time behind the scenes?
Well, this has actually been a topic we've been discussing for a while. In the 2020-21 version, we did rewrite Advisory Opinion 2. In fact, prior to 2020, the current edition of USPAP, there was not a definition of personal inspection. I guess it was just understood, but judging by the number of questions we would get, clearly it wasn't just understood by everyone. And there are these continued innovations. I've heard plenty of times that it seems like if an appraiser discloses that they did not make a personal inspection, that somehow the appraisal is inferior, right? That it's not of the same quality as it might have been had they performed a personal inspection. And then I get the questions about a 30,000 acre ranch where if an appraiser doesn't use some other means other than they inspected 5 acres of it in a truck or by walking around a little bit, that they probably have not done their job to understand topography and water features and all of the other elements that may go into the appropriate description of the subject property. So in that case, flying a plane over it and looking out the window, or flying a drone or an unmanned aerial vehicle over it and examining 2 hours of video might actually be more appropriate than simply driving to the site, walking into the main building and talking to someone about the property. So are we a little late? I don't know. I think it, like some of the changes that we're experiencing in the retail world, maybe this has accelerated some of that discussion as we see that appraisers have become more circumspect about the possibility of someone else providing information. A year ago or so, there was a vast outcry about hybrid appraisals where someone else was doing the inspection. Earlier this year, it became something that was a necessary part of business if we wanted to continue to do appraisals. So it's interesting how things have shifted a little bit. In the end, appraisers, clients may ask appraisers to do individual, personal, interior and exterior inspections, and that's okay. There's nothing that is being proposed that would change the fact that appraisers are used to doing that, may have the ability to do that. The assignment conditions are such that they can. It may be desirable for all for them to do so, and in that case, there would be no change to anyone's day-to-day world.
Okay. Well, I actually have quite a few more questions on that, and I may not get to them all today, but I did want to just jump to one question that is something I know that will come up, and I think would be a good one for address here. Aida, can you go to slide 15 just so that Wayne has it sitting in front of him? Slide 15 is the proposed changes to the preamble. Somebody is asking about, in regards to the deletion of the word you see there, it's crossed out, it says "and communicate." Why are we deleting that "and communicate"? And maybe just highlight, Wayne, that we're adding it in the next sentence there.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to highlight. So, we're going to develop, right, credible analyses, opinions, and conclusions. And we're going to do so. The expectation would be that the appraiser does so with impartiality, objectivity, independence, no accommodation of personal interests. And then in the next sentence, we talk about communication. We're going to communicate those results in a way that is meaningful and not misleading. I will back up and say, we get ideas and feedback from a lot of sources. One of the sources, in fact, one of the primary sources for this happens to be feedback from the recent instructor certification course that was offered this summer. There were questions about the nature of the term misleading. So, is development misleading or is reporting misleading? Well, it takes two to mislead. Right? I can do work, but no one's misled until I communicate something to them that misleads them. And so what we felt it was important to do was to break apart the task of development, which is where credibility comes in, and developing credible analyses, and then communicating those results to the intended users. So that's the point of breaking it apart.
Perfect, perfect. Thanks for doing that. Now I'm going to skip you over to the topic of, you can go to the Q&A slide if you like.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. The topic of significant appraisal assistance, always a favorite, and I understand why people have a lot of questions about it. It makes sense. So here I have two questions. First one, if a client gives me a copy of an appraisal report that was done previously by a different appraiser to use while I complete an exterior only appraisal, is that considered significant appraisal assistance?
Well, I'm going to back up and say that we're proposing a definition that would suggest that no, that wouldn't be significant appraisal assistance because that assistance was not provided to you for your specific assignment. You happen to have received information that someone put together, in this case, an appraiser, that is about the subject property as it existed when that prior work was done. That could have been an inspection done by a certified property inspector. It could be someone, the client may have inspected it and sent you photos. It may be some other source, but because it's not for your specific assignment, under the definition we're proposing, you would say, no, that's not significant appraisal assistance. It's other information, data that you have collected about the property that you are responsible for deciding whether to take ownership of and indicate that you now have enough information to understand the subject property and produce credible assignment results.
Okay, then the part two of this question, which actually piggybacks nicely with what you were just saying, since the appraisal was ordered by since the appraisal was completed, sorry, the appraisal was completed by another appraiser and provided to me to use for information of relevant characteristics, do I need to get permission from that appraiser to use their information?
That's an interesting question.
I know.
In the larger sense, if the entity that provided it to you for informational purposes, there's presumably no prohibition on their having done so. Clearly, you would use caution when including that information. You would want to verify that information, but unless you are trying to pull that prior appraiser into your assignment somehow without their knowledge and permission, then I wouldn't think that you using that source of information would require one to get their permission.
Okay. Now this is a question that has to do with definitions, and the question is, has the ASB ever considered defining the term normal course of business?
I can't say no because I've only been on the ASB for about 4 years or so. So I can't say, the ASB has never done so. I think that's a term of art. What is available in the with some effort being made, and I think that's a term that folks should understand. If one does not make any effort, then one can't say that it was available in the normal course of business or not available in the normal course of business. If you are refused information and you can still proceed and produce credible results, then you've done your job to request it if it's information that you could have optionally received. I know this does come up a lot in the topic of maybe the availability of a current contract or listing, or perhaps information on offers, for an existing property that's for sale. And sometimes a broker or owner or others don't want to provide that information. Um, Certainly it's not mandatory that they provide it to you. If you ask for it and they refuse it, then you can state you requested it, it was not provided, and as an appraiser, you've done your job.
Great. Thank you. Well, I see we're getting close to the end here, so I'm going to ask you one more quick question, and then I'm just going to wrap it up with how you can get comments back to us. The final question, Wayne, is do you think that there will be a fourth exposure draft, or is this pretty much the last one?
We're pretty early in the cycle. We started early this year. In the last time in 2018, I think our first exposure draft didn't go out until late April or May. Because we sort of had a rolling head start after some stakeholder surveys late last year, we did get our first exposure draft out pretty early in the year. I think it was early February. So normally at this point in a typical cycle, we would probably only have a second exposure draft out there, and we would likely be looking at a third exposure draft. So that's I guess a long answer for yes. I would suggest that because we've introduced some new items in this third exposure draft, I think it's probable that there will be a fourth exposure draft.
I love that your answer is basically the favorite appraiser answer. It depends.
It depends. It's like adult diapers.
Okay, well, with that, we are just thankful you came and spent your time here with us today. And as always, 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 as Wayne likes to say, we want to hear from you. That's you, you, you. The third exposure draft is, out there for now. It's open for comment. It's open until November 18th. And to submit your comments, you can go to the link you see there. Or you can always just, call us or contact us. We can tell you how to do that. The ASB is going to hold their next public meeting on November 20th. Normally, this is where I tell you where it's going to happen, but since everything is virtual now, that will happen at your office, wherever you are. So that's at November 20th, 2020 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can click on that link to register, or our website also directs you under our events tab to sign up for that. So with that, thank you again. This has been a wonderful hour, and thank you, Wayne. Any closing or parting words?
Yes, a couple closing or parting words. One is if you can use the Survey Monkey response, that actually does help our team in collating your information. You can write your response in in your favorite word processing software and copy things over, but that does more quickly enable them to collate. And the second is originally we were planning to have our public meeting on November 6th, but we decided to give you as stakeholders some more time to take a look at the exposure draft and send us your comments. So we pushed that meeting to that Friday the 20th just to provide a little bit more time. So please, please, please take the time, take a look at the exposure draft. If you love it, if you hate it, if you're somewhere in between, please send us your comments.
Great. Thank you all. With that, we're at the top of the hour. Have a great day.
Thanks, Lisa. Great job.
Bye-bye, you too.
Bye-bye.